lecture for the 2016-2017 academic year. We have a wonderful guest here who will be introduced in a moment. But first, I'd like to say that we'll be here listening to Brian Price speak for about 50-55 minutes. We'll take about half an hour for questions. And at 5 o'clock, all of you are invited upstairs to the 9th floor to a reception in room 929 with our guest. To give a full and complete introduction to Brian Price, I'm going to invite Elena Gorfinkel to come up and talk about him a little bit. So welcome.
Hi everyone, it's really my great pleasure to be here to introduce my colleague and old friend, Brian Price. His incisive writing on art and avant-garde cinema, aesthetics, philosophy, and the political has been so central, productive, and generative, not only to my thinking, but also to a flourishing area within cinema studies that insists in the fertile shared ground between film and media and philosophy. It's a thrill to introduce him here as well at my institution, particularly as Brian has hosted and facilitated my own intellectual thriving in a variety of venues, editorial, collegial, and convivial. Brian Price, you should know, is Associate Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Toronto and author of Neither God Nor Master, Bresson and Radical Politics from the University of Minnesota Press, as well as co-editor of the volumes Color, The Film Reader with Angela Delavaque, and of On Michael Haneke, which is co-edited with John David Rhodes. He is currently at work on 2 books, A Theory of Regret, The Thought of Bureaucracy, which is forthcoming from Duke University Press, as well as on The Labor of Friendship, Olivier Assayas and Global Style. He's the founding editor as well, with John David Rhodes and Megan Sutherland, of the critical theory and media studies journal World Picture. Brian's grasp of matters of media aesthetics and continental philosophy is wide-ranging, and the scope of his erudition, as you'll see, is quite apparent. Whether discussing the problem color poses to notions of interiority and Rainer Werner Fassbinder cinema, or thinking about the relationship between cosmopolitanism and moving images on the gallery, or considering the genealogies that might link notions of the world and world cinema to the ontological approaches of Heidegger, Brian's work resoundingly shows us an unyielding commitment to the ways in which images work and allow us to think, and the ways that images are themselves productive of concepts and perform conceptual labor. In a historical moment, which perhaps has since passed, in which our field, film and media studies, in particular had professed or claimed that we were suddenly post-theory, some of you may know about. At that moment, Brian's work as a writer, as an editor, and as well as a supporter and booster of others, as well as younger scholars' work, has never foreclosed on the large and pressing questions that only theory, and theory as a humanistic and collective project, can adequately tackle or address. And he boldly asks, in the face of this critique of the theoretical, and I quote him here, that perhaps we, quote, haven't been theoretical enough, not nearly as autonomous as we would like to be from the practices of domination we hope to turn back. And on a personal note, I'm perhaps most grateful to have him here because his generosity and generation of a capacious intellectual community around the shared enterprise of the journal World Picture and its attended yearly conference, which I encourage you all to consider attending and to read the journal, which have allowed and facilitated much of my own, and I know many, many other scholars' work in its most bleeding edge or experimental forms. A community that allows such risks with such an openness and generosity to the seriousness of our shared enterprise of thinking could have come from no more generous and capacious and risk-taking of a scholar as Brian. So here I present him to you as he'll talk to us about the political factor and aesthetic potential of regret. Brian.
Thank you so much, Elena. I deeply appreciate it, and I put my fingers up to some part of that. And I'm really sorry for all of you to be losing Elena. I'm sure that's quite difficult, and I really don't envy you in that. But I'm really glad that I could be here while you're still here. Thanks so much to Ken and to Ali and to Cal and the Center for the 21st Century for inviting me. It's really just already been a fabulous experience. I'm really grateful for it. And also, I've had the good pleasure, fortunately, to be reading Cal's dissertation right now, and this is a stunning piece of work, and it's really a privilege to be in a place that could foster this kind of intelligence and creativity. So it's a real honor to be here. Okay, so title of this talk is Regret and Remake. It is an extension of my book, Theory of Regret. I lopped off the part about bureaucracy. It's in the argument is in the book, but maybe in a different way than when I first imagined it. So this will present in a way what's at the core of my idea about regret, but I wanted to extend it, having finished the book. The book has gone into press. I wanted to try and extend it more directly into the realm of images, which, strangely enough for me, the book isn't precisely caught up. It's more, I would say, an attempt on my part at political philosophy as much as anything else, even though there's a conception of cinema that underwrites it, which I'm trying to bring out more here in a way. So, as the flyer indicates, it will be concerned in a way with Tay Garnett's adaptation, Postman Always Rings Twice. So I'm going to presume some familiarity with that film, but I don't think that presumption is going to matter that much, right? I hope it doesn't. So if you haven't seen it, in other words, I don't think it will really matter. So I say. One of the most remarkable aspects of Tay Garnett's 1946 adaptation of The Postman Always Rings Twice concerns its tone. That is to say, Garnett's adaptation, while no less concerned than the novel to describe the moral complications of murder as a path to freedom, is rather genial in its tone and presentation, at least by comparison. In a strange way, Garnett's adaptation is a very polite film about murder, paranoia, and duplicity. The first-person narration of Kane's novel is, as we know, preserved in the film in a flashback structure that is punctuated in crucial ways by Frank's calm voiceover, even if those moments are relatively well spaced out in the film. However, Garnett makes no effort to exaggerate the visual field in an effort to signify that images we see are only ever the hostile refractions of the world Frank perceives. And I have in mind here something like Ulmer's Detour, right? You know, the moments that he goes mad and scream goes wrong. So, there are moments in Garnett's film, to be sure, where the characterization of Frank makes contact with the portrait of misogyny that Kane's novel so unrelentingly details. One such instance would be the moment in the film when Cora leaves to visit her dying mother, and Frank refuses to take a ride back to the house offered to him by Keats, Cora's lawyer, telling Keats instead, and as he eyes a young woman having trouble starting her car, that, quote, he's going to try and get that blonde out of his head, end quote. On the one hand, the move seems unusually bold in the context of the film, given that the lawyer had just the day before created the condition of Cora's freedom and is also in full possession of the knowledge of what happened to Nick, the husband. Yet, there is something entirely unconvincing about Frank's bravado. I think we know that he is simply trying on a role that he has no capacity to internalize as the newly dominant feature of his personality. That said, he does convince the young woman to go with him for a week in Mexico, which is the still that you see on the right side of the screen, or right. But when Frank comes back and greets Cora at the station and expresses his condolences about the death of her mother, he seems significantly less intoxicated by his own masculine authority, as if the edges of bravado had been softened by regret. I would refer you to the image on the opposite side. In any case, it's a much less abrasive moment of hypermasculine lunacy than what we are treated to regularly in the novel, as when Kane's Frank, in a violent sexual episode, describes Cora this way. Quote, her eye was all black and her breasts weren't drawn up and pointing at me, but soft and spread out in two big pink splotches. She looked like the great-grandmother of every whore in the world, end quote. Or one might recall the moment in the novel in which Frank speaks candidly about the effort that violence requires and says, if you ever tried to break the second joint of a tough turkey, maybe you know how hard it is to break a guy's arm with a hammerlock, end quote. What then to make of these differences? What can we draw from the fact that Garnett's Frank is somehow a little more likable than Kane's, because seemingly more genial, or at least a little less prone to nihilism and its close cousin, melancholia? What I want to propose here is that Garnett's adaptation is itself a significant reflection on the emancipatory potential of regret. Not so much for Frank, who fails to benefit from the regret he nevertheless experiences so consistently, but for us. I'm not concerned with the difference in tone between Kane's novel and Garnett's film simply for the sake of noting the difference in the adaptation. Rather, the genial tone of Garnett's adaptation is critical to a reflection on the emancipatory potential of regret. What I want to propose most broadly is that regret itself helps us to understand both the contingency of what appears as it appears, and in this way offers us a philosophical conception of why remakes happen, about what is most sane or most humble in an impulse that might otherwise be described in terms of arrogance and appropriation. In ordinary life, if we wish to remake or redo something, would we not say or do so in relation to an instance of regret? Thus, what I want to show today is the way in which Garnett's film offers, in its very careful staging of sound image relations, and also its use of rear screen projection, a structure for thinking about how regret works as a perceptual experience, and then what that experience has to teach us in the end about creativity, which the remake stands as an especially compelling lesson in. To do so, though, I want to begin with a reflection on regret itself and its relation to the difficulty we sometimes face in telling contingency apart from necessity. I take regret to be a generative emotional response, one that helps us ultimately to better understand how relations or events that appear to us as necessary, and thus beyond any use of our will, might be better understood as contingent, in which case the character of our action, or else our failure to act, is subject to judgment and self-reflection. In this sense, my conception of regret is founded on a slight revision of the way that Aristotle imagines regret in his Nicomachean Ethics. There, Aristotle quite famously considers regret something that is largely useless to the achievement of virtue, insofar as regret is only related in Aristotle's Ethics to involuntary relations, and never to non-voluntary ones. The distinction itself is slight, but no less crucial for being so. A non-voluntary action, event, or relation is one in which whatever happens will have happened no matter what we fail to do or do. To describe any action as non-voluntary as opposed to involuntary is to negate the will while acknowledging that an effort of the will has indeed occurred. What we have willed will be visible as something willed, but disqualified as a cause of what has happened. It is something like when in basketball a shot is taken after the play clock is run out, which also happens to pass through the hoop. The player cannot be denied the instance of his willing, but the will in this case bears no relation to the fact that the score will not change. So there would be no real point in regretting having taken the shot. By slight contrast, an involuntary action, event, or relation in Aristotle's formulation is one in which a use of the will may very well have changed, or at least impacted in some way, what has occurred, even though it is now too late for us to do anything. To extend the basketball analogy a little further, let us say that an involuntary relation would be one in which the same player refuses to shoot the ball, even though it is not impossible that shot, sent off at the right speed and with the right degree of accuracy, might have a chance to count and thus alter the outcomes of the game. Having taken no shot in such an instance would be a legitimate cause for regret. One way to think of the difference between non-voluntary states and involuntary ones, then, is to regard non-voluntary states as operating according to necessity, in which case our will might mimic or defy the cause that actually determine what happens, while involuntary states are contingent, or at least related to contingency. If something is necessary, then we say that what occurs cannot but occur, and will do so regardless of any intervention we make and any emotional response that we have. By contrast, if something is contingent, we can say that something might occur, but is not guaranteed to occur. I take this to be the most important aspect of contingency, and oppose it to the way in which contingency is too often used as a synonym for chance or the accident, both of which are better described as moments in which necessity rears its head against all human effort, as opposed to the idea that what contingency indicates is flux and mobility. In fact, I would say that in film and critical theory, contingency is regularly confused with states of necessity, as when theorists insist on the necessity of movement or else of failure. Entropy, for instance, bears no relation to contingency, though we often describe the moment in which dissolution becomes visible as the height of contingency itself. In Aristotle's terms, regret figures in the achievement of virtue only in the cases where it can be shown that what occurred did so in part because there was an occasion for a use of our will that we did not observe, and now have to live with the consequences of. Regret has nothing to offer us in his view in the instance of non-voluntary relations, since the grief we experience over what has happened cannot make us more sensitive perceivers of what remains contingent and what appears. The grief we feel bears no relation to any responsibility that we can rightly claim or be held to by others. In this sense, Aristotle's refusal to countenance regret as a possible emotional response to non-voluntary relations is not so much a therapeutic gesture as it is a highly rational one. Indeed, for Aristotle, regret in such instances would be a category mistake. The example that Aristotle provides for thinking about the uselessness of regret in non-voluntary relations concerns, as you may recall, the untrainability of stones. He writes, "A stone, for instance, by nature moves downwards, and habituation could not make it move upwards, not even if you threw it up 10,000 times to habituate it. Nor could habituation make fire move downwards, or bring anything that is by nature on one condition into another condition." For Aristotle, it would make no sense to regret the stone's fall, since the latter will do so no matter how often we toss it in the air. Our emotional response, in other words, will not transform something from one condition into another. Our relation to the stone's fall can only be non-voluntary, in which case the will wills nothing. By contrast, regret participates in the habituation of virtue, and does so because virtue is, for Aristotle, nothing essential. It is instead a matter of practice and decision. While I do not refute this aspect of Aristotle's distinction between non-voluntary and involuntary states, I want nevertheless to suggest 2 points. First, that non-voluntary relations occur much more rarely than we suppose. And secondly, that regret is the very emotion that helps us to recognize the relative scarcity of non-voluntary relations. As a result, regret instructs us about the ways in which what occurs or appears may bear some relation to the use of our will. As evidence of this point, consider the denial of global warming. If I believe that earthquakes begin to occur in a state such as Oklahoma, which up until recently had no real record of earthquakes, and say that such occurrences speak only to the tempestuous and unpredictable course of the Earth's movement through time, and have nothing to do with the increased use of wastewater disposal in that state, you can see what it would take to uphold a belief in non-voluntary relations. It would require something like a belief in divine authority, or else reckless nihilism. Neither response would compel a feeling of regret. By contrast, a reasonable response to a feeling of regret, including the possibility that I may feel regret and not at first understand why I do, is to take as active a role as I can to put an end to such practices, even if all that I can do is vote. And probably I can do more than that. In any case, my vote will not return what was ruined in the earthquake, but it can make a modest contribution to the prevention of further earthquakes. And also, and most importantly, in the context of what I want to say here, it will make me more sensitive to the indirectness of most relations that do invite a use of the will, no matter how small each instance of willing might be. With this sensitivity in mind, I'm also concerned to distinguish for the moment regret from melancholia. As emotional states that are bound to loss, regret and melancholia are nevertheless distinguished by the way in which each state regards or fails to regard the contingency of what has appeared. That is to say, the melancholic knows what has passed, but cannot prevent himself from revisiting what has passed, as if it never has and never will. By contrast, in a state of regret, we know that what has passed, and also acknowledge that it is now too late to do something differently. But we learn in time to be more vigilant in the recognition of the contingency in what appears, which means that something might return as we have seen it before, but is also not guaranteed to do so. Melancholia contributes to the tendency to exaggerate the presence of non-voluntary relations, to insist on the necessity of loss itself, and precisely for the reason that Freud gives. In Morning of Melancholia, Freud contends that the melancholic patient, as we know, quote, knows whom he has lost, but not what was lost within him, end quote. Because the melancholic knows whom he has lost, but not what was lost within him, he seems to be incapable of changing the image that he has of himself, which will affect the way in which he regards what has passed. Perhaps the most compelling part of Freud's argument, then, has to do with the way in which he describes the melancholic as incapable of shame, a point he comes to by comparing someone who is actually good, but once in the grip of melancholia, thinks that he or she is the worst of all people, with someone who is in fact horrible, but does not suffer from melancholia. Freud contends that the latter stands a much better chance of self-improvement than the former, and precisely because the person who is actually horrible may become susceptible to feelings of shame. For Freud, shame initiates the temporal process of mourning, the duration of which cannot be predicted but can be expected. And in this case, regret is closely tied to the temporal uncertainty of mourning, and also the fact of its ending. I would add that regret is the moment of recognition in mourning that hastens the end of mourning. The melancholic, on the other hand, remains locked in an image of the self that he nevertheless insists on featuring for himself and for others. Or as Freud writes, quote, "Finally, it must strike us that after all, the melancholic does not behave in quite the same way as a person who is crushed by remorse and self-reproach in a normal fashion. Feelings of shame in front of other people, which would more than anything characterize the latter position, are lacking in the melancholic, or at least they are not prominent in him. One might emphasize the presence in him of an almost opposite trait of insistent communicativeness, which finds satisfaction in self-exposure." End quote. Most important, at least for my purposes here, is that shame as a menace to the ego is also a problem of the image. If the melancholic only finds satisfaction in self-exposure, the image of the self on display for the one who suffers and the one who is forced to listen remains always the same. By contrast, shame indicates a relation of variability between image and experience. In Shame and Necessity, Bernard Williams very importantly describes shame in terms that resonate with Freud's account, as a moment in which we realize that what we have done or said is at odds with the image that we keep of ourselves. What is important here is not that the image we keep of ourselves will be the right image, in the sense that the image is to be regarded as essential or transcendent. Rather, in the gap that opens between the fact of what I have done and the image I keep of myself for myself, I have an occasion to revise either my understanding of what I have done, in which case I revise the image of myself for myself, or else I forgive myself and try to do what I have in most other instances considered to be worthy of the self I want most consistently to be. If there is an important difference between shame and regret, then, it has to do with the fact that what one laments in a feeling of regret does not necessarily, even though it often can, compel a re-imaging of the self, which might now involve a more flexible account of one's own moral capacities. It merely implies that the renewal of our willingness to do better, it merely implies the renewal of our willingness to do better than we have done. But what regret and shame do share is that both are effective recognitions of what was contingent in what appears and is now past. And what the emotional reverberation of such recognitions does, in both cases, is to make us more aware of the role of our will in the constitution of being, especially as being, social or personal, is constituted in relation to images or events. Indeed, both emotional states gives us the time we need to linger in a state of incomprehension and introspection. Regret trains us against the imperiousness of certainty as the shortening of time between naming and judging, without extending it indefinitely as the melancholic might. With these distinctions in mind, I want to turn now to a few scenes from Garnett's adaptation of The Postman Always Rings Twice to give you a sense of the cinematic dimension of regret, especially since the formal aspects of Garnett's adaptation present us with a complex display of how regret works, and also why it may also begin to explain the virtue of remakes and adaptations, or more to the point, what the practice of the remake has to say about virtue. That is to say, the act of adaptation might very well explain as a cultural practice the significance of understanding the discovered rarity of non-voluntary relations as the beginning of a more responsive use of the will. The first scene I have in mind involves the moment in which Nick has brought Frank back to the house, back to the diner, and thus back to Cora. Frank left, you may recall, after his and Cora's first attempt to kill the husband went awry. That is, they attempted to stage an accidental electrocution of the husband while he was bathing, but succeeded only in killing the cat that climbed the ladder Frank used for loosening the wire. In the scene you're about to see, Nick explains to Cora and Frank that he has decided to sell the diner and move himself and Cora to northern Canada. The scene depends rather importantly on a notion of regret, and especially as it relates to the efficaciousness of the will. Never mind, I was thinking of something else. But I see what writing about regret is. It's a great excuse for every stupid mistake you make. All right. Okay. So, this scene that we've just seen opens rather importantly on the X-ray of Frank's skull, which reveals the damage done to him from being electrocuted and not killed in the bathtub when Nick and Cora made their first attempt to stage a fatal accident. Nick has, as Frank notes, added the image to his family photo album. If Nick can show Frank the photo, then we can say that Frank thinks that he knows what happened to him and also why it did. That is, by way of faulty wiring, and thus as an accident. But as we know, there is nothing accidental in the accident. Since Nick does not know this, he acts in a way that indicates that he regards what happened as an instance of a non-voluntary relation, when in fact we can say that it was an involuntary one, insofar as Nick did nothing, but could have done something. He could have noticed, for instance, any one of the many signs of a mad attraction between his wife and this drifter that he has taken in. But the image he keeps of Cora, and also the one he keeps of himself, depends on, and affects in turn, a sense of consistency in selfhood that has both a material and an immaterial aspect. This means that the sense of the self the husband projects of her, and also of himself, is neither exclusive to the photograph, nor to what he imagines on the basis of Cora's physical existence, or beyond her life in photographs. Recall that the photo we see here of Cora from their wedding is described by Nick as an instance of her cuteness, which is no more a necessary property of the photograph than is the mental image that he keeps of her. This is not to offer a negative evaluation of Cora or Lana Turner, but simply to say that what Frank takes for reality depends on a conception of the self as unwavering in its consistency. And if consistent, the image assumes the character of necessity. Thus, whatever occurs that might be read in opposition to the idea that Cora is cute could only ever be the result of an accident, and thus is something that does not introduce a gap between how things are and how we take them to be. The reason for this is that we regard accidents as always as something contingent, but only in order to confuse contingency with necessity. The taking of contingency as necessity prevents us from seeing what it is that we could have done or known, and in turn prevents us from regarding these accidents as something that could not have been otherwise than they were. When we fuse the accident for something contingent, we redescribe our will in terms of non-voluntary relations, when in fact they are involuntary ones. Simply put, Nick can't see that Cora and Frank are trying to kill him because he is committed to an image of Cora's decency as the way she cannot but be. And it is important to point out here that when Nick asks Frank, "Isn't she cute?" he's not asking Nick about his own perception of her, but is saying what he thinks everyone knows, as if her cuteness is like Aristotle's stone that will fall no matter what. Most importantly, when we regard the accident as contingent, the involuntary relation is likewise confused as a non-voluntary one. What is accidental, in other words, need not be admitted as a complication of who Cora is and what it is that Cora can be expected to do. The experience of consistency that pertains in the projection of the self, of Frank's own, and also of the image he projects of Cora, is what makes that relation function as if it were non-voluntary, which is itself a fairly common description of love. We did not choose the other, the lover says. This is just how things are between us. In this sense, we might describe non-voluntary love, in Wittgenstein's terms, as something made possible only by a technology of experience, which involves the accumulation of homogeneous aspects in the realm of appearance for the sake of appearance. But in the wide accumulation of homogeneous aspects, which can only occur if difference is understood as an accident, a blind spot opens. And it is in this very blind spot that regret lies found. It should be noted that in the same scene that we've just watched, we hear Frank address regret, but in a way that will only fortify The blind spot is something that he refuses to access for what remains productive within it. Sorry, Nick, not Frank. What does he tell Cora as she is clearly troubled about the idea of moving to Canada and becoming the keeper of Nick's sister? But I'm superstitious. Never turn down a good offer. You will always regret it. Nick, in other words, assumes that a good offer will always look the same, which is why you will always regret not taking it. But if one can always regret something because what one has failed to choose is always the same, then what Nick is describing is not regret, but melancholia. What he is describing is an involuntary relation cast as a non-voluntary one, despite the fact that one seems compelled to choose. Grant presents this problem very subtly in the relation between sound and image. After saying, "You will always regret a great deal," we see Nick go into the hallway and make a call that will finalize the sale. Closes the door behind him when we hear him on the phone, making things final and avoiding the very regret he thinks he can anticipate. But since he thinks a good deal is always the same, he quite literally creates a blind spot by shutting the door behind him, where we see Cora and Frank standing and listening, knowing as we do that Nick cannot see what we see. Because Nick cannot access his blind spot, since he has committed himself to a technology of experience constituted by the ordering of aspects in a particular way for all times, he fails to see the new signs of what remains purposeful of the accident, which will soon be the cause of his death. It is perhaps no accident that Garnett will present the murder of Nick, in a scene that also introduces a gap between sound and image. Or perhaps it is better to say between sound and two kinds of image. The image that the film shows us, and also the one that sound might provoke for whomever might hear it. You may recall that in the scene of the actual murder, Cora drives while Nick sits in the passenger seat, completely drunk and full of song, and Frank, who is only pretending to be drunk, sits in the back seat and waits for the right time to hit Nick over the head. But when they stop, Frank gets out of the car and becomes enamored of the echo of the hills. Sorry, Nick gets out of the car. I keep having these names confused. And as you watch the scene again, take note of the echo that follows after Frank delivers the fatal blow to Nick's head. The philosophical implications of this echo, which stems from an act of violence, are rather significant. To begin, we can say that the violence comes from Nick's blind spot, one that is produced by the contribution that both Frank and Cora make in the performance of the aspects that feature homogeneously in the projection of how Nick understands himself and the world to be. It should be added that the scene begins back at the diner where Frank is performing drunkenness for the sake of the DA who will trail them. And it is, of course, the DA who knows to distrust the signs that are being featured for him. As an investigator, it is his job to compare the many different aspects that can be derived from the same object, or projected onto them. After Frank delivers the fatal blow to Nick's head, the echo of the song continues to radiate outward. In other words, Nick has died, but his voice continues on in space as if alive, and in this way, also as if continuous. To hear the echo from afar, and away from a view of the car, one would quite reasonably form the mental image of someone living, of someone singing at a distance. That is to say, what we imagine as having a material correspondence to a body out of sight, but just over there. In this way, then, the sound-image relation provokes two kinds of image. The one we don't need to imagine, since it is the one filmed by Garnett and right there before us, and also the one that we, at the very least, imagine imagining, which follows from our recognition of the effect that such sounds will have the further they become from their source. To imagine imagining the scene, we would also need to open up a different spatial relation to the same thing that Garnett shows us in the manner that he has. And likely, we would do so by imagining them within the same aesthetic world of Garnett's film. That is to say, if we follow the trail of the echo and imagine how someone might respond to what they hear, we would imagine that space, that picture, from within Garnett's palette. Right? My presumption here is that if we were trying to imagine it spatially, we might create a mental image in black and white, right? Or at least insofar as such a thing is possible. What Garnett presents us with in this way, then, is a necessarily incomplete structure of regret. And the only always of regret is that it is an incomplete structure. In terms of the film, this structure is necessarily incomplete in the sense that we can entertain these two perspectives visually at once, but only in a mental state of imperfect superimposition. And every superimposition is by nature imperfect. We share the image that Garnett provides us with, the bottle on the floor, the shot of a stunned John Garfield in the back seat, but what we can't share in anything like an exact way is the picture that we imagine that is provoked by the echo itself, even though we can imagine imagining it in ways that are roughly similar, since we are likely to form our picture on the basis of what Garnett has pictured for us. If this is so, then why consider these images according to a structure of regret? In opening up two different ways of seeing the same thing, Garnett stages the possibility of a choice. Granted, it is not a choice that we as spectators will make, since we do not need any options. We know what happens and why it has happened. In the course of the film, we see Frank experience regret, but his regret, and precisely because he cannot read signs as well as he should, is converted to fatalism. What matters for us is that we see how this or that use of the will stems from a choice that may be made in confidence when it is really made in ignorance, which stems from a confusion between states of contingency and states of necessity. If, for example, the DA had heard the echo of Nick's jolly singing as a sign that everything is all right, since the sounds of gaiety seem always linked to at least benign states or acts, he would have no cause for regret. If he assumed that sounds of merriment are always linked to states of innocence, then he could keep driving, assured as he no doubt would be, by what he could with confidence describe for himself as a non-voluntary relation, in which case he would feel no regret. And in one sense, we might say that he would be right to do so, at least insofar as the sound of merriment is not an expression of murder, but is instead what lingers on as joy, even once a violent intervention has been made. This would be the Aristotelian reading of regret. We could not regret a lack of response to merriment, since merriment is not caused in this case by murder. But this is also why Aristotle's distinction between non-voluntary states and involuntary ones is both powerful and too simple, precisely because so many relations are indirect relations. Locutions like instead imply an absolute direction and causality that serve logic but defy the unequal and manifold character of causality itself. Much like my example of the wastewater infusions that are creating earthquakes in Oklahoma, where there used to be none, we can say that the assumption of an image of innocence or benignity that we imagine in relation to the sound of merriment would, in this case, be a legitimate cause for regret. It is a legitimate cause for regret, insofar as one might soon learn that this particular sound was not simply a sign of merriment, but that said merriment was itself produced earlier in the procurement of drinks that would cover over, in both the performance and the reality of intoxication, a murder that was staged as an accident. In this way, if we came to regret our assumption that what we heard was at best benign, then what we become aware of is the distance between the image we have kept and the way things really are. Most important about the gap that opens between the image we have kept and the way things are is that the recognition and admission of error does not leave us in turn with a more stable relation between the image we keep and the way things are, but instead with an increased awareness that there will never be a necessarily stable or predictable way of ascertaining the way things are. In saying this, I'm not suggesting that things can be known whole, nor do I want to suggest that there is a clearer image of prediction. Rather, what regret does is to remind us not only of what is past, which can be named in what appears, but to return to Freud's conception of mourning, what has gone missing in what has passed. In this respect, regret is not restorative, much in the way that we imagine that films and paintings or worn-out shoes can be restored. Rather, regret simply makes us more responsive to contingency in what appears, more suspicious of our certainty. Regret overlaps with the definition of contingency itself, insofar as what occurs may continue to occur, but it's not guaranteed to. In place of knowledge, then, regret is a way of being responsive to what might move as it moves. In place of melancholia, regret trains us to expect something other to appear than what we have lost. All of this I want to suggest, and as I promised at the outset, bears an important relation to questions of adaptation. To a consideration of adaptation as a way of understanding the generative character of regret itself. What am I doing in a state of regret, if not entertaining two different images of the same thing at once? Much as we have seen in Garnett's adaptation. In thinking about what happened, and how I first thought it happened, my memory is overlaid with not only what I did see, and now see otherwise, but also by an image of what it would have looked like if I did X instead of Y. By contrast, if I'm in a melancholic state, I only feel the strong presence of something I nevertheless know to be gone, and experience that loss endlessly, which means that I can only see what disappeared in one way, in addition to it being the only thing, in a sense, that I see. There is nothing generative in melancholia, because a gap never opens between the picture I have of things and the way that things are now. As a result, I have to live in ignorance of the very blind spot that would otherwise be restorative. In this sense, melancholia is the condition of genius, but not of anything generative. In terms of adaptation, then, we can say something very basic that is also, in my view, rather significant for being so. Adaptations are, in their own way, an effort to see the same thing in two different ways at once. They are also ideas that show themselves to someone who will decide, in the course of doing something related but different, to make something new from something else without either repeating it exactly or else introducing a break that is so radical that we do not recognize the new form from what came before it. And as I said at the outset, regret and the will to adapt have something in common, namely a wish to do something differently than it had been done already, which does not imply something totally different, but a variation of what came before, the trace of which still registers. This is, in my view, one way to account for the very subtle use of rear projection in Garnett's film. Consider this brief scene, which comes from the moment in which Consider this brief scene, which comes from the moment in which Nick finds Frank in a market in downtown LA and brings him back to the diner, and thus to Cora. In the voiceover, we will hear Nick speak about how he was missing Cora, which means he wants to try once again to make this relationship, unorthodox as it is, work with her. You'll notice that the scene begins in an instance of location shooting, as the camera pans right and notices Nick at a distance. Notices Frank at a distance. At that point, Garnett cuts to a medium shot, Frank smoking, I can't stop, I'm speaking of the melancholy part. The medium shot of Frank smoking, while we listen on as he muses about the loss of Cora. You will notice that with the cut from the pan to the medium shot, Garnett has also placed Frank before a rear screen projection of what we just saw, one shot previously, as location shooting. By beginning this scene as an instance of location shooting that gives way in the next cut to rear screen projection, Garnett very subtly indicates the temporal multiplicity of what we are seeing and hearing. The voiceover, of course, indicates most plainly that what we are seeing as the present is actually the past. At this point in the film, we do not know where Nick is when narrating. We can only imagine imagining it. In terms of the image, however, we are seeing someone in the same space, but at two levels of temporal remove. In the opening pan, which I'm calling location shooting, let us say that Nick is in the present. But we know that he cannot be, since the voiceover tells us otherwise. Thus, we have at least two times, and at least two different places, or the same place imperfectly duplicated. With the cut and the introduction to rear screen projection, we see Nick standing in the present, but against the backdrop of something that had to have been recorded at a different time, even though we are meant to see it as the same place. What Garnett makes clear then is that the image he now uses, the rear screen projection, appears to us as an image of the past and the present, and as such, It is one that very subtly opens a gap in a visual field that is otherwise meant to be understood as continuous. And it is not for nothing I propose that what happens here is that Frank is getting another chance to stage a performance, another chance to organize the aspects of the accidental. Frank is reflecting on Cora, just as Garnett is reflecting on James Cain, and also perhaps Visconti or even Pierre Chanel. If his images are different than theirs, they do not, nevertheless, come from nowhere. Even his own images are marked by the not-so-seamless and not-so-obvious rear projections, which, to say again, are images of the same thing that come from two different times. As such, the images are marked by difference as much as they are marked by sameness. In aesthetic theory, Adorno offered a very surprising distinction between genius and geniality. Thanks, surprising for us readers of Adorno. Surprising also because it would be easy to assume, much in the way that Nick regards these self-evidence of Cora's cuteness, that Adorno would always be on the side of genius over geniality. And yet for Adorno, geniality is much more germane to aesthetic experience than is genius. More to the point, the distinction he draws there between genius and geniality offers a way to see the aesthetic dimension of regret and the attendant ethos of adaptation. Opposing the autonomy of genius, Adorno writes that, quote, the concept of genius becomes the potential enemy of artworks. With a sidelong glance at Goethe, the person back of the work is purported to be more essential than the artworks themselves. In the concept of genius, the idea of creation is transferred with idealistic hubris from the transcendental to the empirical subject to the productive artist, end quote. The reason for upholding this notion of genius, Adorno supposes, has to do with our desire to glorify, quote, pure human creativity, end quote, so that one does not have to face directly the difficulty and the complexity of the artwork itself. Why is this so? Because the artist, as someone in whom the transcendental subject can be transferred seamlessly to the empirical subject, is regularly thought in terms of consistency. That consistency is just as often marked by the artist's melancholic way, which the work of art, as something different and difficult, will only stand in defiance of. By contrast, Adorno also suggests that, quote, to be genial means to hit upon a constellation, subjectively, to achieve the objective. It is the instance in which the methexis of the artwork and language allows convention to be discarded as accidental. The signature of the genial in art is that the new appears by virtue of its newness, as if it had always been there. Romanticism took note of this. The work of fantasy is less curatio ex nihilo, the belief of an art-alien religion of art, than the imagining of authentic solutions in the midst of effectively pre-existing nexus of works, end quote. What better way to describe your projection, and for that matter, the adaptation in general, than by saying, as Adorno does, that the new appears by virtue of its newness as if it had always been there. To say as if it had been there is to announce with the new work of art, and in this sense, the work of art, properly speaking, draws as discontinuous in what continues. To say that it feels as if we have seen this before, instead of saying that we have seen it before, is a way of acknowledging how it is that we can see, and however imperfectly, two things in one thing. Without the as if, the remake would simply be a repetition. And if a repetition, then it would not exist, or at least it would not be noticed. This is also what melancholia shares with genius, which looks only to itself as itself. It is the dream for those who do not share the melancholic disposition of the void in being as a source of unparalleled creativity. But as Adorno suggests, fantasy cannot be an instance of creation ex nihilo, and by this he is not merely accommodating or acknowledging the pre-existent. Rather, he suggests that fantasizing exposes the non-existence of genius, since, quote, fantasy cannot be the mere capacity of escaping the existing by positing the non-existing, end quote. One indication of this, I would suggest, is simply that the many examples of science fiction that image worlds in ways that resemble our own. The adaptation of the remake, however, depends on the as if, which means making something we have never seen from what we have seen before, and in a way that cannot be a duplication, even though what continues must be present in what does not continue. As a cultural form, then, the adaptation and the remake, regardless of whatever they show, are always genial. And they speak in affirmative tones about the character of regret itself, which will always be more restorative and inventive than either genius or melancholia. What the remake has to teach us in just this respect is what it means to experience the responsiveness of the will in its attunement to indirection. Thank you.
I really love the idea of rear projection in particular as a kind of signification of the potential regret. And I think about that especially because it is kind of technological necessity. Because not only is rear projection behind the actor, it's projected from behind the actor, right? So there is a visual gap for the performer as well. And I was just wondering if you could expand on this notion of rear projection perhaps in other remakes as well, and how you consider it in the moment of production as well as potentially a signifier of the structures of regret.
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about other instances of rear projection in terms of the structure of regret, with the obvious exception of Vertigo. In a way, because, and I think that Hitchcock is perhaps the filmmaker that really sort of made me notice this, right? Very intentional use of rear screen projection. For instance, that moment in Vertigo when Scotty is chasing who he thinks is Madeline, and she fakes the suicide, right? And you have that moment which we're seeing location shooting in San Francisco, and then clearly a set. And I think that sort of sharp contrast, we are really meant to notice that sharp question precisely because, well, one reading, Chris Marker's reading, right, is that although not at that point, but that one way of reading Vertigo, as we know, is that this is a projection. This is what Scotty's projection of the world as he imagines it, or as it's being performed by him for others. The interesting difference maybe between that film and Postman's Always Rings Twice is that is what happens in the second half of Vertigo, where Scotty he has the opportunity, at least as I would read it, in the moment of the dream when all of his habits of perception come undone, right? In which the flowers just become abstract color forms, but then he takes on the same way of perceiving the world again, and it produces a kind of violence. And so, in that sense, it's a film that bypasses the possibility of regret, right? As a matter of his own and her their shared psychoses. But in terms of, I can think of what I really mean to do is to really go back and look at film, like a bunch of film noir again, because my hunch is that that's where we might see more of it, since film noir is so much about regrets in this way. And I think I really love Robert Pippin's, I don't know if you know his book on film noir and fatalism. I think it's a gorgeous idea. But I think that one difference is that I think that a lot of those works, which he reads, for instance, as a way of thinking about a kind of reflective model of consciousness, in which case we define who we are on the basis of what we do and how we come to terms with this different way of seeing ourselves than we had seen ourselves before, but then it's always too late in the films that he's describing, right? He's interested in the ones that really take on that fatalist trajectory. But I think that a different way of seeing that, and films that use rear screen projection, and most of those films do, certainly Lady from Shanghai does, and some others, would just be to say that, as with this film, right, you could read this as a kind of fatalist film. There's something really horrifying about the ending, the way in which Frank really accepts his fate as the work of God, which is different from the way that the novel ends, but that just has to do with how the characters respond. Like, there's something about the structure, I think, of film noir that I think really enacts this experience of regret. It just means that it's not happening for the characters, right? It's happening for us potentially in that way of thinking about it. So even for me, that just as important as the screen projection would be the voiceover. Yeah.
I was wondering, how does regret relate to betrayal? Because it seems to me that, I mean, betrayal is, of course, a key element of the novel and the film.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, in a way, like Nick, who gets killed, right, is saved from ever having to feel regret.
Right.
Right? I mean, in a way, like he dies without ever having to confront his blind spot.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me how this concept came up in a couple of occasions in your talk, because, like, for example, Nietzsche in Human All Too Human says that, we're all, like, the blind spot is what we're really well defended against. And that the only way that we can actually experience it is if someone betrays us, right? Which leads us into the psyche, as he calls it, by sort of the back door.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, like, if you're talking about regret, I mean, could it be that the structure of the narrative itself is, in some ways, hiding perhaps even an even greater trauma, right? I mean, in a way, like being killed is, at least for the unattractive husband, a kind of salvation, right? Given the fact that he never sort of realizes that there are these sort of dark forces, around him.
Yeah. It's really interesting. My quick answer to it, perhaps too quick, is to say that, I mean, this is where the distinction between what works of art do and the staging of regret, structurally, like we see in the sort of what the sound image relations here, is significantly different in terms of acts of betrayal that lead to murder, right? Because in that sense, like if we murder someone and we come to regret it, it's not very likely that we can be forgiven for that, certainly not by the law, right? And so in that sense, there's nothing terribly generative about regrets, right? Except that, the time that I serve, for whatever time that would be, right? I might sort of refine some aspect of myself. But in that case, it's strictly for myself, right? Because there's not much that I can do. Any sort of way in which I can find myself back to, a moral act wouldn't really be possible because there's nothing I couldn't extend, any kind of kindness or sorrow or apology to the people that I would have affected in that sense, right? So that question of betrayal, I mean, so another way of putting it is, it kind of depends on the extent of betrayal, right? On the other hand, if I feel betrayed by somebody because they've done something petty to, like, advance ahead of me in my job, that kind of betrayal, right? That's where I think, regret would be potentially very importantly related, because say if I'm the one, who betrays my friend, I might very well come to my senses and apologize, right? So that I don't keep doing it to other people. But in that sense, we are talking about a difference of degrees in terms of betrayal, right? So one between reality and fiction, and the other between betrayal, the kind of betrayal like this, if it were a case of actual murder, in which case one can't be forgiven, or a kind of more common acts of betrayal, right? Where regret really matters because it can really do something. I think there would be an interesting relation, and I hadn't thought about that passage in Nietzsche, but of course, I mean, I think that really agrees in a way for me with that question of, like, how do you find your blind spot? And the only way, in fact, right, I think, as you're saying, is if somebody helps you to find it, right? Or something that you do allows you to find it. Yeah. Otherwise, you're right. I mean, how does one know that one even has a blind spot? That's why for me, in the book itself, which is much more concerned with the relationship between regret and thinking, right? That's for me, I was very struck by the relationship between regret as a form of sort of withdrawal, like thinking as a form of withdrawal, that really relates to the way that so many continental philosophers, define thinking, right? It's always a kind of withdrawal from appearance, and so in that regard, the Nietzsche seems especially relevant, right? That unless we're hurt in some way, we may not be compelled to reevaluate ourselves and our actions in a sense. Which means also that we may end up hurting others, right? As we all do in some way, one way or another. Yeah.
So my comment sort of builds on Jocelyn's. I was just wondering if maybe you could play a little bit with the way that regret sort of plays out formally in this kind of still that we see here. So the kind of the back projection, we have the figure who, in the particular moment that we have right now is looking downward, And since I'm an art historian, I think of things like chiaroscuro, the kind of like, Leonard-esque sort of shadows on his face, which give us a sense of a figure thinking, this idea of thinking and regret is closely linked to each other. I feel like it's playing out in a formal way, really interestingly.
I think that's right. I mean, there's also, and once you've seen the film, you know that where the voiceover is coming from, and so you can also see the space that he's inhabiting, which is a prison cell, right after he's been charged with murder, even though he's been charged with a different aspect of the thing that he didn't do, but it doesn't really matter, right? Hence the idea of postmortem twice. So I do see that in that way, and so it is that I think that being aware of those temporal differences, I think is really important. I think one of the ways, if I were to pursue this more in terms of images, and precisely in our historical veins, I'd become very interested in contradictory. Especially in Derrida's Politics of Friendship, he thinks about the problematics of friendship as the sort of the alignment of the contradictory and contretemps, and so that so he's looking at that figure of although for Derrida, I think he imagines a full silhouette, right? But if we think of contradictory, that say Bonnard and his self-portrait of contradictory, where you see the face is semi-obscured and then you see details still. Really meets Derrida's description, which is the ontological problem of influence, right? That if you, that he says of Nietzsche, that one day that he had to realize that he'd written this paragraph, and he loved the paragraph, but then it belonged to Nietzsche, right? So who am I, he says, right? That I'm least like myself when I'm most like myself, right? To see this influence that this text had. And I think that in a way, what's interesting is that I think thinking about regret in pictorial terms, by way of Bonnard, and also by examples from film rather than absolute silhouettes, is that you begin to see that more complex ontological register in which, of course, we're all derived from the things that we loved and that we found and that we might have forgotten, but we're also different, right? So for Bonnard, his self-portrait and contradictory, you have to see part of the details of his face, the other parts have to be obscure, and so that is a way of registering both things. And so for me, that would square with the kind of reflective dimension of regret, right? In the way that in Derrida's text, he regrets his way. There's a kind of it's a really. I love this book because it's you really feel the kind of terror of recognition in his prose. Like how is it that I can escape the things that I love? And what would it mean to do so? And I think that regret is one of the ways in which you begin to think about it. In the same way that, like in the 400 Blows, when we see the young Bonnell, and he's this child who is asked to, basically by his teacher, right? What is Bonnell in the film? Maybe he's like 6 or 7. But he has this passion for Balzac, right? He sits at home in front of the shrine of Balzac, and he reads, and his teacher asks him and says, go home and I want you to write, your life story. And he comes back and he reads his life story, and then, the teacher realizes this is just Balzac, right? But he doesn't know, like to him, he can't say what the difference is there, right? Because he's still too young, actually, to build this kind of, the capacity for regret, right? He's thoughtful, right? He's drawn to Balzac. It's better than the world he's living with his parents. But he can't see himself apart from it either, which you have to be able to do, right? To escape narcissism and to really be able to become reflective in a way. So yeah, there is, it's really a long way of saying that I think there's a really important visual aspect, even beyond, rear projection, but rear projection would be a part of it.
Thank you for giving me if you've already addressed this because I was part of your talk about it. I was wondering if you could, I was interested in the distinction you're making between adaptation and remake. If you could say something about that, and also how you would position Visconti's 1942 adaptation of Post Miller's Twice in relation to the Garnet 46 adaptation as a remake.
I don't mean to make a distinction between remake and adaptation, actually. I think of remakes as adaptations, actually. Thank you for pointing that out. I should be clearer about that. In terms of Visconti, very different films. You know, you know, it's, and yet you do, what interests me, I would say, I don't think I can offer a particularly, I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say about that comparison yet, but but I did see it recently, the Visconti film again, Sessione last year, and as I was beginning to do this work, and I was, it was sort of experience, really interesting to watch it, and to just be aware of the moments in which I'm remembering Garnett's adaptation, or Chanel's, or even just thinking about how I imagine the novel to be. And I find that that's, you know, that's always, to me, I think that's a really interesting question about adaptation or remakes, or however we want to describe it. You know, that, as we know, like, it's in some ways, I was very hesitant to give this paper because, on the one hand, there's nothing more boring than a paper about adaptation, right? Because it is like, you know, it's like film studies from 1970, you know? And those of us who trained in film studies, right, we try to do our best to say, to be cooler than that. But I do think that I really became convinced at some point, or at this point, that there is something interesting about the way that adaptations or remakes sort of force us to become aware of the way that we're always picturing as a factor thinking, right? You know, and especially because, you know, that thinking and consciousness is always so often, right? The larger issue here for me is just the way in which thinking is always conceived in terms of language, and so it's much less often that one really regards it in terms of images and picturing. I mean, it's there in Hegel quite strongly. But I think it really needs to be, and Deleuze, but it needs to be brought out even more. And so that's for me, it's sort of, I'm really amused by those experiences now, and really just how we can sort of shuttle back and forth between these images at once, or maybe many at once.
Yeah, and the idea of regret, I don't know if I get it wrong, but to me, I think it could be interesting to think about in relation to the film that's been banned, 1942 film is banned, it's a neo-realist film. It's done precisely for its neo-realist aspect of showing Italy and distract. And then this glamorized Lana Turner and 1946 version, the Hollywood version, doing such a different kind of. I don't know what even. I don't know. There are a lot of things to think about. I've shown them together in an application course now.
I gave this talk recently, and there was somebody who was really, really didn't like, just found this version of this adaptation just horrible, right? And I couldn't quite understand it, and it was interesting to tease it out because it was that I think that he had felt that it was a betrayal of some of the nastiness of Cain. But what I love so much precisely about this film is exactly is geniality, and that is what's different also between this and Visconti too, right? Because the Visconti film is tough. And whereas this film isn't, despite the fact that it is about something really horrible. And yet it really keeps the whole way through this kind of all shot to genial tone. And the husband in the novel is not Canadian, but as we know, Canadians are very genial people. So that's a signifier, right? The geniality of the film itself, right? Its awareness, I think, of what creativity might mean as opposed to the kind of tortured state of genius. And I think that's sort of important, actually. I'm joking about the Canadian thing, but also IELTS do it, right? I mean, he's trading on a kind of stock image of Canadians. I don't really mean to say that all Canadians are genial. It's not true. But it is, he's playing with an image, right? He's invoking an image, a kind of stereotype of a people just up there. Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of connections you might draw between regret and something like indexicality. I guess I'm thinking of Dudley Andrews with what cinema is, where he kind of is recuperating, but doesn't have to make an argument towards cinema and adaptation. And it strikes me that there's something similar about indexicality gesturing towards the two images at once, the images we have and the image that must have been there. And it strikes me as a similar kind of, at least some resonance with the idea of regret.
That's interesting. You know, I've woken up a couple of mornings in the last month remembering Dudley Andrews' Mists of Regret, his book about poetic realism, thinking I really should have gone back and read this book again, and I will. Yeah, that makes sense. What's interesting about the index, I think, is that the mistake of thinking about the index is that it's in fact this kind of absolute sort of causal bond between the object and the image, but the index, of course, is always pointing to something that's moving away from it, right? So in that sense, there is something interesting, in the index as a shifter, that you can point to something, but the concept of the index always importantly has to be separated from any instance of the index, right? As a way of beginning to understand precisely how it's not, that the index is not indicating a causal relation, right? It's sort of, that's pointing, right? The pointing to something is not sort of a securing of something. And so, in a way, I think that's really interesting. And it also, I think more at the front of my mind in that respect, in Dudley Andrews' book, although I think it's interesting that I see it, is Cavell, right, who really thinks of the image as a form of displacement. Right? And in that sense, that's why, in the book, I do make some gestures in this direction to say that it's why cinema, I think, one of the things that's really interesting about cinema is that it shows us things that we might recognize from the real world, but it gives it to us in a different relation, right? And so, no matter how conventional a film's style might be, right, ontologically films can't repeat the same. It's one of the really interesting things about images, right? Is that, and so in that way, every image introduces some measure of the difference and reordering in relation to a style or to a particular mode of sequencing. And so, in a way, I would risk a very general theory of cinema, which is to say that on the one hand you could say, as Cavell does, that it gives us a way of thinking about worlds and reordering of worlds. One way of thinking about the reordering of worlds is to say that it produces for us a kind of daily experience of what it might mean to change our minds, which regret has a way of hastening that we might not otherwise feel. Yeah, Elena.
I just have a somewhat open-ended question about the corrective function of regret, or regret as a kind of pedagogical.
Yeah.
So it's not just, regret doesn't always have to be, but I think it's it opens out onto what regret can do or not do. So then it's also the operability, or kind of the capacity of regret to become operational. So there's this way that you were saying that regret's not restorative, but I think it is corrective, and then you have this kind of, there's a certain implication that there's a way that regret trains us. But then, it's interesting that noir, there's the fatality of noir actually, in some sense, it kind of highlights or exposes, it exposes regret, but in some ways it's also very deterministic. So I wonder about, also maybe it's linked to this kind of philosophy of the will and questions about the nature of action, or kind of how someone might feel autonomous and able to act. But I was curious if it's just the corrective and the aspect of training, or because that seems to be also where we deposit the kind of potential of regret to do things, but it's also, it might not do, it's just so I guess it's a bigger question about what kind of political emotion is regret also.
Well, in terms of corrective, I don't mean to indicate corrective as a way of getting us back to something that's true or can only be seen in this way. I don't mean it in such a sort of moralistically determining way. It's corrective simply insofar as what it sort of trains us to do, I think, is to assume with increasing frequency that non-voluntary relations are much rarer, right? So, for instance, one of the examples I give in the book is that if we go and, we almost go buy a house, and this house is near a volcano, and the realtor says, well, this volcano is inactive, it's never, it hasn't erupted in 100 years. I don't know about Hawaii, whether this would be true or not, but it's, but if I have this fantasy, right, that this is going to be my life, I'm going to live in this paradise and live next to this beautiful volcano that never erupts, but all of a sudden it does, and my house burns down, right, I can regret that because, in a way, I took, I invested, I had an image of what I thought the consistency of that space would be, and yet there's a much more indirect relation, right, to how things are. Like I could have considered, for example, that this realtor is only interested in selling my fantasy to me, right? Or, things like, I use the Oklahoma example because I think for a lot of people, right, we're starting to see all these stories on 60 Minutes, that finally everybody's acknowledging that Oklahoma is having earthquakes every day, and they're really massive ones, right? And in Oklahoma, as much as I love Oklahoma and Oklahomans, it's been a hard sell, right? It's just that world's turning because the world's turning, and it's hard for people to see because most people who live in Oklahoma aren't invested daily, right, in sort of putting wastewater back into the ground, right? And so you might not think that continuing to vote for the people who make this possible means that you have any relationship to it at all, right? So in that sense, and as I said there, like it's not that finally recognizing and regretting the fact that I've always overlooked this, it's not going to prevent those earthquakes from having happened, but it might make me more conscious of the weak relations and where my responsibility lies, right? In some really ordinary way, right? So yeah, but there is that word corrective. You're calling my attention that it indicates a kind of idea that there are things that are sort of epistemically verifiable or normative, and I don't really need that either.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And again, I'd like to invite everyone upstairs to 929 for reception.